So our next session is on broadband access. And in particular, we're going to talk a little bit about how the state of Iowa's most recent effort to identify communities that need better broadband, called the ITQ process. We're going to talk a little bit about what that tells us potentially about how the state of Iowa and maybe other states that have a similar process will be deploying funding in the future. So our panel, we got Todd Kielkopf here from CBAN. Todd and I worked together on a couple of different ITQ implementations, or I should say applications, for two different counties here in Iowa. Brittany Morales is with the Iowa Communications Alliance, and Brittany and I ran into each other a couple of weeks ago, and I said something about ITQ, and she probably almost threw something at me because that's all they've been doing is answering questions from provider members about what is their role, if any, in the ITQ process. And I'll explain what that is in just a minute. And then down on the end here, we got Ryan Arment, and Ryan is here representing Joe Citizen Without Broadband. Ryan got a hold of me a few months ago, and it just learned about CBAN, sent an email through the CBAN portal and said, help me. Me and my neighbors don't have any broadband, and we're trying to figure out what the heck we can do to get broadband. So Ryan joined CBAN as an advocate member, and he and I have communicated back and forth and tried to help him find some pathways to getting better broadband for himself and his neighbors. And Ryan's cooking up some really cool ideas that may see him actually becoming his own provider. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So the ITQ process, how many of you are familiar with the process that just ended last Friday, at least the application process? Okay, so ITQ means invitation to qualify. When you look at the state of Iowa, and the OCIO office administers the broadband grant program for the state of Iowa. They've done a really good job so far in administering those programs. It is a very difficult job. Their staff has worked really hard and diligently to do a good job. And through the past, 3 or 4 years, they have gone through several rounds of broadband grant applications where providers have applied for and received funds to build out broadband in unserved and underserved areas. This last round of funding, NOFA 7 it was called, Notice of Funding Availability, which was completed, at least the applications were completed last year. NOFA 7 money actually didn't come from the state coffers like some of the money had before. This money was sourced from the federal government. It was part of COVID relief, some of the broadband money that came down through that. And so in that process, the state OCIO had to change a little bit about the way they have to do the follow-up on the rules, because the federal government rules, there's a lot more red tape than there were on the state rules for the previous rounds of state broadband grant funding. So I think we have, anybody in the room, a provider that applied for and received NOFA funds, NOFA 7 funds? Okay, we got a couple of them there. I think that you'll agree that the process of applying for receiving those funds and getting reimbursed is more difficult than the previous round, right? Erica's nodding her head at Muscatine because they did NOFA 6 and 7. And Kurt, were on NOFA 7. And I don't know, Doug, did Premier do some NOFA 7, 6? Yeah, okay. So the process has been a lot more difficult, and the providers that have received that funding have complained aptly about it. But it's not really the state of Iowa's fault. It's not the OCIO's fault. They're having to deal with the federal rules that got passed down. So the ITQ, we know more money is coming from the BEAD fund, that last big infrastructure bill, right? And we know that the state of Iowa is in line to get some big chunk of money that it will then have to give through grants out to providers to expand broadband. Before that BEAD money is available, and therefore before it gets deployed, the state of Iowa decided to take a step back. The OCIO did. And Jeff, if I'm saying anything that's incorrect, Jeff's like, I'm new here too. I don't know. Okay. I'm trying to make you sound good, man. So they decided to take a little step back, and they started this process called invitation to qualify, where instead of the providers raising their hand and say, I would like to serve this area that's unserved, they asked communities to raise their hand and say, we have some areas that are really high priority to us that we want the state to prioritize for funding. So that's what this process was. It was a short window, as are most application windows for grant funding, although this was not for funding itself. And that window closed last Friday. So I'm not sure how many communities applied for the ITQ process, but we know that a number of communities have identified what they call broadband intervention zones, where they would like the state of Iowa to prioritize this next round of funding from BEAD to go to. So that process has been quite a bit different. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And if anything, what does that tell us about how the state of Iowa is going to deploy broadband funding in the future? Because we still have a tremendous number of unserved and underserved locations out there in the state of Iowa. And if you look at the maps, it's probably actually more than the maps show, because we know there are some providers in particular, not to name names, fixed wireless providers that over-report what they can deliver, and then and in order to freeze out others from building in their areas. So, Brittany, I'm going to start with you. Just about the ITQ process. We talked. We earlier had talked about that you were, getting a lot of providers calling you, asking what they should do. What were their questions about?
Yeah, and can you hear me okay out there?
Yeah. The projector's on? Off? Want me to turn it off? Is it blinding everybody? Sorry.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Probably doesn't look good on camera either, does it?
So I'm just going to briefly give a little bit of context to, like I said, I'm from Iowa Communications Alliance, and I handle business development. We represent about 120 locally owned, community-based broadband providers across the state. And so when you step back and look at that, that's a pretty wide coverage of where our members are. So as in each area, every corner of their state have their own challenges and questions with the ITQ process. But when you really step back and look at it as a whole, I came into this role with an economic development background. So I know a lot of people who work in rural economic development. Now I'm working with broadband providers, and what kind of seemed to be happening is it wasn't so much about a question the providers were having. It was a lot of the community groups who they already have partnerships with. So your counties and your councils of governments coming to them and saying, we don't really know anything about broadband, or, we don't know where the zone, what we want to make sense of this. Like, what makes sense for where the zone should be, how big it should be, where's your existing infrastructure? So I think what I saw happening was a lot of providers becoming partners with those community groups, county groups, council of governments, because those people were saying, we don't know, you know. And so I think you saw a lot of partnerships coming together about that, and also just trying to wrap their head around this new process that they're like, hey, community groups, you don't know anything about broadband in this sense of where the zone might make the most sense to be. And now you have 30 days to put in an application.
Right? Not a lot of time.
Yeah. So.
Well, Todd, I'll have you talk a little bit about the process that we went through. We worked with Madison County, and Tom Lenners is here. And we also worked with the folks in Johnson County to help them. What Brittany says is absolutely right. You don't know what you don't know. And if you're a local government leader and you're expected to raise your hand and go through this process and you really don't know how to do it, talk about some of the things that we learned, and how, in our case, the two communities we worked with were in better shape than maybe others, because they'd already done some of the initial data collection and research to figure out where these areas were that were underserved, what citizens and what residents needed. And so talk a little bit about the process that we went through with those two counties.
Yeah, and I thought what I do is kind of walk you through just some of the key components of what's in there, and maybe what we can take away that is actually very beneficial, I think, from a community development standpoint that the state took. So the first thing you had to do was put together a cover letter. And you think that's pretty simple to describe how a zone is defined as a problem, a perpetual problem. And that's what the state really wanted to hear about. Where are you having perpetual development problems? Because we don't know why those are perpetual at the state level. And then what leadership support do you have? And can you describe that and articulate that you have a cohesive leadership support to actually go out and solve a problem? to me, that's pretty unique for the community broadband space right now. We haven't seen that from the state. And so I thought the just being able to be asked for community leaders that if you're going to propose something, make it comprehensive. And and the cover letter wasn't scored, which was I think good, because they weren't going to be done right. They weren't going to be done perfect, because community leaders who were asked to develop those and sign those letters of support, and they had to be signed. That was kind of unique too, on letterhead, which means people had to approve things. It wasn't just a low-level staff person at the city that said, "Hey, I'm the city clerk, and I know we can file this." A lot of times, that's the way programs get done. So you had to say who's taking the lead and who else is going to be at the table. Well, that means other people had to be at the table. You had to reach out maybe to people that normally a city clerk or a finance person at the county planners that only do right-of-way management, that never talk to broadband. Oh, we're supposed to do that now? And by the way, we get community capital points if we build a program around this. One of the things that came out in Johnson County, not just of this, but the study that was done before, was that they had already decided all the broadband providers should get all the right-of-way permits on a quarterly basis and know when housing developments are going to come in Johnson County. That's not been done in the past. So broadband providers didn't even know that 30 homes were going to be built 2 years from now out in the middle of a rural development. But this process was giving them points as community capital in this application for having a communication process between property developers and broadband providers. So that's another component that had it. They're going to prioritize the impact. So if you look at what the federal requirements are, they're looking, how's that impact people? Does the broadband impact people of minorities? How does it impact people of low income? How's it going to impact people with disabilities? They're actually looking, those are scoring criteria. So when all these data points got dropped in by the state, they automatically uploaded all the geographic information, statistical and demographic from the databases that we can't get to, nor can any other county government official get to nicely. So they've never looked at it as a standpoint of, well, we know that little zone over there is super high impacted by that modular home development that has a lot of people with disabilities in it. But all of a sudden, when we were looking at these applications and Johnson County could pull this stuff together through their GIS, we were seeing what the state was going to be seeing. And that's because the federal government is going to make some of this a priority. They're going to score those higher. Because I think that weighting was almost twice the scoring of, hey, people want it. And the last piece about that was community support. We talked about that. But also, we had testimonial letters. They actually wanted to hear from, the state wants to hear from the stories. We think they're going to read some of those. And also then the state's going to take this information, and they're not just going to take what we give them at the community level, but they're actually going to try and interpret it and mesh it together. So part of the things is they reserve the right to take 2 or 3 of these zones, piece them together, add another mile or two, get with the providers, and they're going to do something more with it. And so that was one of the things that we were saying was, yes, we have to submit all these zones. There's actually supposed to be, we're just supposed to give them enough logical information to make them want to go look more in those zones by giving them better scores. So those were the kind of takeaways that I had that I thought were very unique from a community development standpoint that I've not seen as a consultant, at the community level.
And I think that, one of the things that, we mentioned is if you think of all the communities in Iowa, 99 counties, how many hundreds of towns, very small percentage of those have actually really focused on broadband because let's face it, these little town officials, these county officials, they're busy with 1,000,001 things. And counties spend way more time on drainage ditches than they do broadband. Yet broadband, in the end, maybe that's the one thing that gets clogged is their broadband. Their drainage ditches are fine, but their broadband gets clogged up. So forcing communities, or at least giving communities the opportunity to go through that process, I think was extremely healthy, and I think will help in the future for additional, opportunities that come down the line, whether they're broadband or not. So, Ryan, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Just maybe kind of relate the conversation we had here a few months ago when you reached out about what you were going through with your neighbors in Northwest Madison County, which, by the way, we made sure Ryan's house was in the circle that Tom drew on his application.
Yeah, so can you guys hear me? Is this on?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. My wife and I, we decided to move to the country. We bought some land, we built a house, and then we got the house and we realized that there's no good internet options. So we got our dream house, but we had no real good internet options. So we found a couple of WISPs that would provide us with service, but they weren't reliable. And then I became available for Starlink, so I got that. And that kind of solves the problem, but it's not ideal because it's not capable enough to scale with a family of 6 with, streaming. I work from home. My wife does stuff online all the time. So I don't think it's going to scale. So as I was reaching out to all of the providers I could think of, everyone just kept saying, no, we don't provide service there and we're not going to in the immediate future. So I had no plans. I had no options. So finally talking to my wife, I'm like, well, maybe we can solve this ourselves. So we started going down the route of let's become our own service provider and see if we can help our neighbors who have no service as well. So that's kind of where we're at now. We're still going down that route, but it's going to be a process. Funding's an issue. Everything's an issue. It's hard to do, but we're still trying to make our lives better and make our neighbors in the surrounding area better as well. So that's where we're working slowly towards that. And the other issue I found is that, like with the grants and that kind of stuff, they're not startup friendly.
Right.
So as a startup, we don't have any income, we don't have a track record, so we're not going to be eligible for those. So if we do this ourselves, we're going to have to take it 100% on us. So it's going to be a lot of risk, putting up like houses and that kind of stuff to say we're betting that this is going to work. And if it doesn't, then we're living on the street. But
maybe you live on a street with broadband though, right?
Maybe.
One of the concepts in any marketplace is that you have what are called near customers. So they're the customers that are not taking your service to the fullest extent that they're willing to pay for that service. If they get the benefit of what they want out of that product or service. And so what I think we've seen in the underserved market in particular, like I think you're in that underserved with WISP and maybe Starlink in there, is that when we were doing the 11 county broadband study for Central Iowa with HR Green, sponsored by the Greater Des Moines Partnership, we came up with the idea of needing to develop an online marketplace for broadband so customers could self-identify themselves as being near customers. And that would be a role of government, or that would be a role of an economic development agency. And what I think is interesting about this process of the ITQ is that the state is basically collecting the basics of the data. If that marketplace ever wants to get formed, it says, I've got a neighborhood development out here, and you can see that broadband provider. You might be 2 hops, skips, and jumps from us in your planning, but at least you can do 3-year planning to try to get to a known set of near customers that would be willing to convert to customers. And I think that's where we've really been missing is the providers don't know where the state money will come in. The state doesn't really know where it needs to be targeted. And this process is probably the first best data collection point that if you're going to just create a brand new product in a market, that's where you would start for market discovery.
The process itself, though, Brittany, talk a little bit about not necessarily the ITQ, but we know that the ITQ is probably going to be used by the state to prioritize some funding areas for our next round of funding. We also probably know that those next areas, the rules for that funding are going to be as tight or tighter than NOFA 7 was. What are you hearing about from community-based providers you serve about the roadblocks of the funding itself? Yes, the money is great, but wow, that's a lot of work.
Yeah. And I think that you hit it right on the head when you said that. You got to step back and look at our membership. So 120 locally community-based providers, right? over 95% of them are offering fiber. That's their main core business. They're doing it that way. But they're small. They rely on consultants to do a lot because they're doing a lot in their communities and the areas. But let's say the average size of the staff might only be 8.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're looking at federal rules and policies and regulations coming down on them, it's very difficult to figure out how do we make that work? How do we put in that time and meet those requirements and still be able to function? So there's a lot of hesitancy there. Let's wait and see. But some of the things that we've seen, like you said, on NOFA 7 and what we're hearing coming out of BEAD, folks are pretty nervous about it.
I've heard, yeah, Seth.
So I'll just add some context there because, I work with a lot of service providers across the state of Iowa, a lot of the same ones that Brittany's working with, and similar conversation, right? And I think the bigger issue that this raises up in my mind, because we talked to a lot of people, are you going to go after funding in NOFA 7? Are you going to wait for NOFA 8? What's your deal? A lot of folks said we don't want to touch NOFA 7 with the 10-foot pole because of exactly that. And it's, all the qualifiers, it's all the administrative piece, forced participation in certain programs. But, what it comes back to, and this is where the conversation always kind of rounds out, is, well, if we don't do it, somebody else does because that funding is still there. And as you said, you got an average staff size of, say, 8 or 10 people. So then what does this funding lend itself to? Companies that have large enough staffs that can go, do all the red tape and everything else in Iowa or all over the country. And I think that's one of the bigger issues that we see, right? Because we all know those names. We know who they are. They're the exact people that, we're trying to come in and hopefully provide a better service then. So, just interesting because
to Seth's points, we don't represent we won't say names, but the large out-of-state carriers with the capacity to, and you want to attract the quality providers. And Curtis, it's almost twofold here. It's the rules and regulations that are coming out with future programs, but it's also how much of a match from the state or the federal government are we going to get? Because our state has been through 7 rounds of NOFA funding, and these small local providers, a lot of them are saying, we're getting tapped out. We need a higher match here to make it happen. And it's not that we don't want to serve an entire zone of the ITQ. If a community didn't, partner with a provider and they drew an 200 square mile radius, that's fantastic. We would love to serve all those homes. However, is that financially feasible for our company? I think some customers, why are we getting left out? Why don't we have service yet? It's extremely costly to build future-proof long-term solution to you. And how do we start making that work through partnerships? It's similar to rural electrification back in the day, right? For these rural areas. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent.
On that too, right? Because
I'm going mobile. Look out, everybody.
Seth, come on up.
Yes. So okay, but this is you're on like the exact right street here, because then what you run into, what we've discovered is people say, okay, we'll build these networks, we'll get the funding even if we get more match, but then we got to go hire people to help us take care of it. And we all know that's not an easy thing right now, especially in rural Iowa and smaller communities as well. So I think that's going to be one of the next steps, right, that we're going to see, is that how are we helping pull some of these people back in, or helping enable some of these service providers that don't have as easy of a time because, all the network engineers want to go work at Principal downtown or something else. They don't want to go work for, ABC telephone. They hear telephone or telecom and, they think it's 100 years ago, when in reality, there's a lot of great stuff happening in the industry.
Yeah.
Really, really good point. Jill?
Just to tag off on the costs and everything that are going up, Brittany, I'm sure you are hearing what Renee and I are hearing on a regular basis. I just took a call yesterday with NOFA 7 awardee, and she's wondering, how do I do this? Because our costs are 60 to 80% higher than what we bid. And they're wondering, how do we do this?
Yeah.
So this is the problem with the providers right now. They are just getting hit from all sides.
Yeah.
Broadband labels, new regime, all this stuff coming out for regulation is unbelievable.
Yeah, and where I'm hearing that, again, 120 providers, I'm hearing that all across the board. Our estimates, we are way over budget. How are we going to make this math pencil out? So the zones are great. The identification is great. The process of it is great. But the results to me are what matter. what actually comes out of it. And I think there are challenges here that go deeper than some people may realize.
From a cost perspective, I think the costs are just going to escalate. I mean, like with the whole BEAD funding aspect of it, when you look at the NTIA and how they've crafted that, I mean, like, I think they meant well to their defense, but like, as an example, one element is, the Buy America, Build America. I mean, so you think about that, there's going to be, the country's going to be awash with what, 42.5 billion, funds for, building broadband. But, oh, by the way, they want us to source that, through American manufacturers, which I think is all well and good. I think we'd all like to see us buy American whenever possible. But you think about that, as far as all the elements that go into broadband building, outside plant from fiber optics to electronics and all that type of good stuff, how much of that's actually available here? So I'm just thinking about the whole supply and demand and how that's all going to play out once that funding becomes available and they're out there trying to buy all this equipment. I think it's just going to lead to extended delays in outside plant construction as well as escalated cost based on supply and demand. My 2 cents worth anyway. Thank you.
I just have a question, and maybe it's probably more for the OCIO gentleman. But when we, sorry.
That's what CBAN says.
So when we looked at the map that came out, some of it was not updated with the previous NOFAs, so it was hard to determine if an area or a zone is really ITQ eligible. How is that going to be addressed?
No, Jeff, you know all things.
So while I have been involved in some of these conversations about ITQ and the map and all of those fun things, that is not my program area, and I do not feel comfortable answering on behalf of the state for that. But I can get you to the right person.
I probably could have told you that, Renee, but I'll let you throw him under the bus, and we're just glad Jeff's here. Patrick's the map guy. That's Jeff. He's equity. Don't throw him under the digital bus. Ray, you were talking about Buy American. I think that's a fantastic policy, but we have to have Americans that are willing and able to sell stuff to us. And right now, our American manufacturers can't keep up, or they can't do it at affordable rates. So, keeping me running here.
I know.
That's okay, Seth. We want this.
We hear, obviously there's priority on that. And, I work for Calix, right? We make a lot of equipment that's going into these networks. And I'm not speaking on Calix's behalf. This is just what we see out there. If you're going to go and move operations manufacturing to America, it takes time to go find those facilities, like you said, Ray, to get the parts here, to be able to get the components and put everything together. And we're talking about years when people are saying, I need internet now, right? And that's going to be one of the biggest issues I think we run into.
And one of the points I want to make is I think this process that they're going through is meant to be messy. I think we should all just understand that friction between what can be done, what needs to be done, where it needs to be done, and the affordability of it is meant to go all on the table to make the soup. We can't just sit there and have one program for affordability, one for connectivity, and one for this, one for that. And equity is at the table. Citizen engagement was one of the scoring criteria for community capital. So I applaud them for actually building that in. But part of it is we all have to know that I think it is going to continue because they're going to actually allow you to modify these, which tells me they want to see where the friction goes and where the water kind of evens out a bit about what can be done and where it can be done and where the formulas are to optimally get things done. Because they are saying they're going to modify and allow resubmissions and modifications on down the line, challenge the maps a little bit more. Sure. So I think you're just going to keep seeing that friction points, but we shouldn't shy away from it. My point is that's when everybody needs to come together and understand that it's all those perspectives that allows the right decisions to get made. It's not just taking my ball because I'm a builder and saying you should give me all the money to build, or I'm the state, I want to give all the money away, or I'm rural, it's like, no, there's
Well,
some art to it.
We all knew broadband maps are a problem, right? We've all been, wringing our hands over broadband maps for a long time. One of the things this process brought to mind for me was mapping in and of itself is really hard. For example, Madison County, we've got a guy going to build how many homes? 30? 39 houses in rural Madison County. And they're not on a broadband map, right? The reason is there is no address there yet, because until there is a house, there is no E911 address assigned to that area.
Until they pull a permit, there is no address.
Until they pull a permit, there is no address. So how do you address addresses that don't exist yet, but will in a year? And those people are going to be sitting there with their really nice houses they're building going, hey, help me.
And most medium-sized home building companies have at least 10 lots in the planning process that don't have an address because they've already made the investment in the land. They just haven't put streets in yet. So if you want housing growth around your town, you're going to be able to figure out how to work with the developers. Now, and the conflict part got really interesting on the community capital. They threw out there, the state of Iowa did, to use TIF as an incentive, tax increment financing as an incentive for broadband. Do you realize how many years and years and years we've tried to advocate for the use of TIF, and the county governments are the one at the city level for anything, and they bash the cities for using it for golf courses. They bash the cities for using it for streets. And these counties now are the ones sitting in the driver's seat that can have 40 homes in a housing development where there is a massive shortage of housing, massive shortage of workers, and they can actually be an advocate using something to build a network using tax increment financing, the value of the houses. That is meant to drive some conflict. They're talking about SMIDs. If you haven't heard what a SMID is, it's a self-supporting municipal improvement district. They can tax themselves to put conduit in. No one has ever advocated for that like we have at the community level. But now it's in there as a community scoring possibility. It's very interesting that if you would get rural Iowa legislatures to start advocating for things that can actually build things, to solve problems using the tools that they themselves most of the time blame urban cities for wasting
or abusing.
Yeah. So anyway, that was my other takeaway of that whole process. When you really got the nitty gritty, there's some interesting concepts that we've not seen.
I think it is forcing some outside of the box thinking. That's for sure. Yeah, Tom.
Well, I was just saying, I'll wait.
Good man. Let's hear it for Tom for waiting for me to. The steps are getting done today.
So to pull it back up a few thousand feet, one of our in-county providers was plowing cable or pulling fiber to cell phone tower. One of my friends, a fairly unassuming guy, and had going chopping weeds or mowing lawn, whatever, he walked over and said, how much to go up to my house, which was a couple thousand feet away. And they kind of looked at him and thought, well, sure, Sparky, we'll give you a number. And because I've heard this from both sides, from the provider and from the guy. And he says, okay, and I'll be around. And they gave him a number. It was like $6,500. And he says, okay, who do I make the check out to? So I think when you're talking about SMIDs and all these other things, I think if the people have a chance to talk to their county government, they'll be all in.
Yeah.
And
in their application, we call that a voluntary assessment, because you can actually do that under Iowa code. You can do a voluntary assessment for public service that then you can collateralize the cost of that and go get borrowed money for against the lien, because you have a right to put a lien on the property. They do it for sewer all the time. They do it for water all the time. If a group right outside of town needs service in order to develop something, the cities have always been able to say, well, we'll do a voluntary assessment district, and away we go. Broadband has just never been thought of. You could actually, we've advocated for the Iowa Finance Authority to get involved and just finance at the state level, and because you can collateralize the asset.
My daughter lived in the west end of Waverly when they were putting their fiber project in. And I believe everybody had to write a $500 check in the neighborhood that was, and that's how they decided what street they'd go on next. So there's a little peer pressure. I don't know if there's any part of that in the application or not, but I would think there'd be some earnestness from the population involved too. So
Putting your money where your mouth is. I know, a lot of providers that are out there, you mentioned $6,500. I think that's, the number they were shot sounds like it was probably a fairly reasonable number. But I know, having worked with enough providers, especially ones that build in rural areas, that's a really hard way to design, roll out, or operate a network when you're just adding these random connections on and they weren't part of the original design. So sometimes that's why that check is bigger, because not only they have to extend that line, but they have to change how they do all their routing and everything. So way out of my league, and probably way more in the weeds than we need to get on this discussion. But motivated, 6,500. You got Ryan down here. He's ready to build his own internet provider company at risk with his own money and maybe in some investors, because he needs broadband that bad. What other kind of thing can you think of in America right now that people want and need so bad that they're willing to do that? It's just amazing how much broadband has become so vital to so much of what we do. So that's really important to keep in mind here too, as we were trying to come up with these creative solutions. One other thing I would just say, Brittany, I think you'd probably agree with you on the members that you have. I'm really worried about this next round of funding not going to people like Doug at Premier Communications, or Matt at Vinton Municipal Utilities, or GRM Networks, all of them in this room today. I'm worried about it going to big companies that have traditionally abused the system to pay dividends to their large investors, not to actually build networks. There's a county here in Iowa that Todd and I were lucky enough to do some work with here a couple of years ago. They did a broadband study, and one of the big providers wanted to participate. Oh yeah, we would love to do that. We would love to do that. We've got these areas that, if you'll just give us, 90% match, we'll be glad to build fiber in those areas. And I talked to the guy, I said, listen, one of the reasons that no one's listening to you is the fact that you guys have been accepting high cost of service dollars forever in those exact same areas, and they still have 1.5 meg DSL. And now you want the government to give you more money to do that? You have not been a good actor with previous funding rounds. I'd rather see that money go to Grand Mountain Communications or someone like that I know is going to get the job done. And that's what I'm really concerned about, is everybody, it's the small providers that belong to CBAN and ICA and others, Iowa municipals, are all going to say pass on this next round because of the red tape. And that means here comes Windstream, here comes CenturyLink. They can hire all the consultants and lawyers they want to do all the paperwork. And so that's not a problem for you, but I don't think it'll ever mean they get the work done.
We did try in our applications where they had a section for what are the barriers to broadband that the state might not know of. And I thought that was interesting. And so we did put in basically a 5-bullet point paragraph of one of them being incentive awards. I think we just kept it generic. Incentive awards being awarded in places that people just don't seem to want to build very fast. And that is doing nothing but freezing out other competitors who can come in and want to build things at the local level, and they want to do it now. And these little pocket zones, we can't keep having those. I think if we tried to give the communities to the state a voice, I hope that people would reiterate that to the state, that when you look at the map and you see these little triangles and pockets where somebody has come in and bid at the FCC level, and then everybody else is frozen out because they don't want to overbuild, that in itself is a market failure. I mean, it just is. So, and because we thought there wouldn't be any other voice unless we were the ones saying that.
No, and you're absolutely right. So what I call it is holding communities hostage. That You use freeze out, I use holding hostage. And another word that I use is, how do we start to measure reliability? It's what a lot of places have access. They can get broadband, but is it the speed that they need and when they need it? And that's not a factor in any current scenario with mapping or scoring or who's going to serve where. And it is, to me and our members, a lot of times the most important factor. And I don't know how that, if someone can solve that, I think you have hit it on the head, but that's the challenge.
Big challenge, because all of these programs, past and for the foreseeable future, are reliant on one definition, and that is speed, and that is speed as reported by the provider. So it's relying on a little good faith here, and it is speed only. So if your network's capable of providing 100 megabits per second by 20, theoretically, you can claim that's your speed. And if you're like me, whose service, fiber fed service in West Des Moines, Iowa, was down for 72 hours, I don't consider that good service. But that doesn't matter because they can report it's gigabit. So that whole way that we measure what's available and what's not available is just broken. So, all right, we got a couple minutes for questions before we take our next break. Please make me run. Ryan, you got a microphone. You don't need me.
I was just going to say, as an average consumer who is going through this, like I'm a technical person, I'm a software developer. I'm willing to do the research to find internet service. As an average person, if I go to Google and say, who's my internet service provider? I'm going to get 10 links from the 10 biggest providers. Yeah. Maybe none of them provide service. If I wasn't willing to go down this rabbit hole, I don't know if I would have ever found like the Iowa broadband map or the FCC broadband map to say, you know what, this is who services you, this is who could service you. Here's grants going to be available. You know, in the future, you may have service here. It would be very difficult for an average user to find that information. So it's just hard to, like, even at a community level, you know, there's a small provider in your community, to have the community, the county or whatever, say, this is who we would recommend, you know, kind of push them up and maybe not push up the CenturyLinks or whatever providers out there. So just get that community support for the small.
How about the state of Iowa spending some of this money to reach out to the communities?
Absolutely.
Reach out to the individuals.
So a lady that I work with, she's in an area that's been granted money from a provider to bring service there. And I was talking to her about how her service is, and she's like, it's terrible, but I don't have any options. I'm like, well, they're a company. They're supposed to be bringing fiber to your area. She's like, what company is that? I don't know anything about it. Like, and they're supposed to be providing service soon, and she didn't even know.
Well, those providers are likely not to inform those folks that they're going to get service until they have a hard and fast plan.
Right.
Because if they come and say, hey, guess what? We just got a grant. We're going to build to your area, and it'll be done by September 2026, because that's what the deadline is for that funding.
Right.
That person's going to be calling them every other day. So they're not going to say anything until they have a hard and fast plan or until they start actually planting flags and doing locates. Do you have something?
So you don't have to do the microphone. I was just going to say, you know, just from one state organization, we point people to the FCC's map because that's the only place we know to point them, right? So they go to that map, look at their address, find out what providers are available. There's not a lot of other ways to gather that information. So when they're asking about who can be my provider in this area because this one won't come for the next 14 days to fix my internet, that's the only place we know to point them.
One tool that's out there is broadbandnow.com, and that's pretty valuable, but that only goes down to the zip code level, so sometimes it's not real good.
I'm Doug Boone, and I'm a provider. We've been doing this for a long, long time, and have been very, very fortunate to receive a number of grants over the years. It is difficult. The compliance part of it is very difficult. Our very first grant was a $500,000 grant that required 500 pieces of documentation before we were able to pass it through to receive the funds. So first you have to fund it. Then you have to build it, you fund it yourself, and then it takes another 9 months before you get the proceeds. That's a big challenge. We've also been partnering, I think, is just critical. We have partnered with a number of places. Some counties have actually provided us ARPA grant dollars to build out some areas. Just excellent. We've also been at places where they want to charge enormous permit fees, and that becomes, just very difficult. So I think that as a community, just really find ways to work with a good, solid provider, and I think you'll find you'll get a lot of you'll have good success.
Todd and I have worked with a couple of counties before, and that's one of the things we always encourage is kind of have a regular chain of communication with the providers in your area, because sometimes we just don't talk to each other enough. And if you do that, you're going to have the possibility of partnerships develop that if you're talking past each other, you never would. So any of you in here are part of a community-based government or an organization, try to open those lines of communication.